Welcome, everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our virtual event this afternoon here in Washington. My name is Bob Ortung, and I'm a research professor at the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies, and I'll be the host for today's event. And we have two excellent speakers. The first speaker will be Marlene Laruelle, who's the director of our institute, the Institute for European, Russian, Eurasian Studies, as well as a research professor at the Institute in GW. She's also the co-director of PONARS and our Central Asia program. Her research explores the transformations of nationalist and conservative ideologies in Russia and nationhood construction in Central Asia, as well as the development of Russia's Arctic regions. So she has the whole area covered, and she has two books coming out later this year. One is Russia Fascist, Unraveling Propaganda East and West, and a second book entitled Memory Politics and the Russian Civil War, Red versus White. So please look for those online soon. And our second speaker is Akhmet Yarlikapov, who's a senior research fellow at the Moscow State Institute for International Relations, McGill University, where he's at the Center for Caucasian Studies and Regional Security. He's currently researching Islam and ethnic cultures, modern Islamic movements, ethno-political and ethno-confessional conflicts in the North Caucasus. He's also doing field research on Muslim communities in the Asian part of Russia, including in the Russian North. He's the author of Islam among Steppe Nogai in the 20th century. And I see there's already one question online asking how one can find a copy of that publication. So maybe Ahmed could address that toward the end of his talk. So please, Marlene, why don't you start, and then Ahmed will give his thoughts, and then we'll open the floor for questions and answers. So if you're in the audience and you have a question, please put it in the Q&A box, and then I'll read those questions to the presenters when we get to that part of the seminar. So Marlene, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Trying to, to see how I share my screen. Sorry. Here, and then, yes. And you should see my screen coming up. Yes, do you see it now?
Yes, that's perfect.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Bob, for hosting this event, and thank you, Ahmed, for being with us. In fact, what Ahmed and I are presenting today is part of a special issue of Problem of Postcommunism that got published the end of last year, where a group of scholars was looking at the rise of Islam in Russia's far north region. And so I will be summarizing the first article of the special issue that I published with my French colleague, Sophie Oman, and the article is available in open access. You have the links here, so you are welcome to have a look. And then Ahmed will be presenting his own fieldwork done in Novy Urengoy. So the goal of our research was, in fact, to look at what is happening with Islam in all these Russia's Arctic cities, knowing that a lot of labor migrant from Central Asia, from South Caucasus, especially, of course, from Azerbaijan, and internal migrants from North Caucasus that have a different legal status, all are going for work in several Arctic cities, and therefore they also contribute to the development of Islam. They take Islam with them when they go in the north. So during the field trip I did with my colleague, we went over several of both big and small cities in the Arctic. You can see the list here, almost 20 cities, looking at the way Central Asia and Azerbaijani North Caucasian migrants were living, and especially looking at the rise of the way they were adapting their religious practices to their new environment. And so we first began to try to understand what was the kind of institutional landscape in terms of religion and the development of Islam in these far north cities. And you can see what we try, what we hope is a complete list, but it may not be. We look at cities that have a mosque, those that have prayer house or prayer room. And of course, all that is only the religious places that have been officialized, institutionalized. There are, of course, a lot more that are just private organized privately by religious communities. And so what is interesting to see in that list is that it's really the Yamalon-Nenets region and region that is really where you have the biggest Muslim communities and the most organized, because you have a long tradition of having both Tatar and Bashkir working on sub-Arctic oil and gas field already during Soviet time. And now that's where you have the majority of this labor migrant, and Ahmed will be developing on that. And then you have the region of, you have the Republic of Sakha, Yakutia, that is also relatively religiously open and friendly, and several municipalities have been authorizing the construction of mosques. And then if you compare, you see that region, you can identify a region where you have very few migrants, like Magadan Chukotka, and Nenets Okrug, and you can also see that in Murmansk, where you have a good community, you have very few religious spaces that have been authorized for migrants. And that tells us a lot about the way religions and the relationship to Islam is managed in all these Arctic cities, that in fact it's a very decentralized process, right? Each municipal authorities are acting as they want on authorizing, not authorizing Islamic communities, building a mosque, and you can imagine all the politics that you have beyond, exactly the same way you have in Europe, with sometimes the Russian Orthodox Church refusing or pushing the authorities not to allow the construction of a mosque, or some nationalist patriotic groups being afraid of having suddenly Muslim all meeting in one place for the Friday prayer. So the same kind of fear that we have in Europe, you can find them in the Russian far north cities, and you can see the municipalities are acting very differently. And what is really interesting is that in Yamalon-Nenets and in Khanty-Mansiysk, the municipalities try to be quite welcoming when the Islamic communities are asking for the construction of a mosque, because they represent a big part of it's really rising communities. So let me move on telling you a little bit more about this kind of institutionalization process, and then I will go more on the practices. So what was interesting to look at is that you have a big competition, institutional competition, between the spiritual board based in Ufa and the Moscow-based Council of Mufti in trying to take control of all this mosque and this Islamic community, because they are symbolically important and because some of them are quite rich. Right, so you have a real institutional struggle. There was also a struggle with the spiritual board for the Asian part of Russia that progressively got reintegrated, but it's something that probably Ahmed will be mentioning. There have been a lot of tensions on this kind of institutional affiliation of these growing, rising new Islamic communities in Siberia globally and in the Far North in particular. There have been several projects of creating kind of Arctic subsection for both the Spiritual Board of Muslim and the Council of Mufti that never really worked. So far, all the mosques are dependent geographically on what is the big cities near them, but they were unable to create a kind of Arctic identity institutionally. And then what we found really fascinating, and that's going back to what I was saying a few minutes ago about the diversity of reaction of the municipal authorities, is that when you look at the funds that have been given to build mosques, is that you can see how much diversity is. So very often in Yamalon-Nenets, Khanty-Mansi region, it's Russian energy firms themselves that are helping the communities to fund the mosques. So you can see there is a real strategy by Gazprom and all the subsidiaries of Gazprom to really kind of show some friendly attitude toward the request of a Muslim organization. You have a lot also of private patrons, like successful businessmen who wants to showcase their dedication to the community. Very often these businessmen are either Azerbaijani or Tatar and Bashkir, and so you have this kind of diversity of ethnic representation, with Azerbaijani, Tatar, and usually being the richest, the one that are the patron, and then the everyday life of the mosque is managed by North Caucasian and Central Asian. So you have a kind of ethnic hierarchy in being successful in funding an Islamic community. And then in small cities where there is no big patron, then it's usually the community itself that is trying to fund the mosque, and that means that usually it takes them a very much more long time because they don't have enough money. It's very difficult. Very often some mosques are stopped at different level of construction, and then there is no more money to finish them. And so you can see how much it's diverse. But what was interesting to notice is that it's very rarely foreign money, right? Because the Russian state is very careful, and the municipalities are themselves very careful in avoiding foreign money to arrive. And there was even some scandal sometime when Chechnya and Kadyrov tried to fund a mosque in northern region. And then that, of course, created a kind of reaction from the municipal authorities saying like, well, in that case, we are not interested in having the mosque fund. Another big issue that all these Islamic community are facing is how to secure imam, and that's a big issue. And here also you have a total decentralization of strategies. Sometimes the community is asking Moscow or Ufa to send them an imam. Sometimes they decide to designate their imam themselves. And so we had some cases in a very small community where they don't have a lot of money to pay their imam, where they were just inviting a citizen from Tajikistan to come, so labor migrant, and to become their imam. And then after, when this person accepts, this person has to go through all the process of being recognized by the spiritual board or the council of mufti, and being trained to be recognized as an official imam by the umbrella institution. And it's important to remember that in Russia, you need to be a Russian citizen to be an imam. So these migrants have to become also to go through the process of securing the Russian citizenship if they want to become official imam. And that's something Ahmed will be mentioning. There have been several tensions, as everywhere in Russia, about defining who are the radical in Islam, and the Wahhabite, or now the kind of Salafi, those who went fighting in Syria. And there was a kind of peak of cluster of tension around Yamal and Novy Urengoy, and Ahmed will be coming back on that. So what makes this polar Islam polar, and why are we trying to use the term polar to describe it? And of course, you understand that it's not really a theological terminology to say that Islam is polar. Islam is always Islam, but it has to adapt to certain norms. So the first one, the most visible, for example, was to adapt to climate. And so it's really interesting to look at how mosques in the far north are built, because they have to take into consideration the harsh climate in which they are living. So these mosques are built on permafrost, so they are usually based on steel. So they use all the architecture system that has been developed already during Soviet time to be able to manage the change of permafrost. They have to resist high level of snow, so they have to change the way traditional mosque in Russia would be built by changing the roof are made. They also have very often to change the way they are doing the minaret to be sure they can manage facing wind. So all kind of architectural adaptation of mosque to the Arctic climate. And also, of course, ablution rooms have to be inside, not outside, given the climate. So knowing that you want an ablution room for men and one for women, it means all these mosques have to secure 2 more rooms, which means that it's often an issue because it means you need a quite big building if you have to have the ablution room inside. So that's the kind of the first adaptation that we were noticing that we find kind of interesting. Another issue related to adapting Islam to climate was two important issues. The first one was funerals. As you know, many migrants, when they die, they want to have the body going back home, but sometimes it's not possible, it's too difficult, and then more and more local cemeteries have to build a kind of Muslim corner where Muslims can bury their dead family member. And so it creates a lot of issues on the way you want the body to be buried. You know that it is in Islamic tradition, very often you want it to be buried directly on the soil, not in a grave, but in Arctic condition. That's not possible because, of course, of the permafrost changing and the snow. So a lot of this kind of adaptation to funeral rituals have to be built, and of course also the time of prayer has to be not, because you cannot really follow day and night when you are in a polar climate. So especially during the Ramadan months, it's quite difficult for Muslim in the in polar region to kind of follow the usual schedule. So each mosque is now dependent of a southern city. So for example, if you are in Norilsk, you will be dependent of Krasnoyarsk, that is southern big city. And that was before decided locally, and now it has been centralized. So it's the Moscow or Ufa who are telling each mosque how to adapt and how to adapt for prior time. Another interesting element was, of course, to adapt to remoteness. And so there are several elements here that were noticeable. The first one is how much halal food has been developing in all these Arctic cities. It's a big phenomenon all over in Russia, but it's particularly interesting to follow in Russia's northern city because of their remoteness. So you have a whole business of being sure that halal food is delivered to the region, very often always going through Moscow. So there is this whole kind of centrality of Moscow where the food is arriving from several regions of Russia to Moscow, and then it's dispatched from Moscow to these different Arctic cities. And usually either if the community is big enough, you will have some shops selling them. If the community is too small, then usually the announcement that the halal food has arrived is done by some social media network that tell you where you can buy some meat or other kind of product. And also because the communities are still small and remote, mosques often have a kind of small shop inside and a small kind of grocery shop where you can buy a lot of things coming from Mecca very often, any kind of product, cream and so on. So you have this kind of interesting business model developing. And then, of course, another key element of this kind of remoteness is that the community has to be quite unified. And so at least at the official level, all the mosques are multi-ethnic. As I said, it's usually, the patron is usually an Azerbaijani, Tatar or Bashkir, but the everyday life at the mosque is usually managed by Dagestani, Tajik, Kyrgyz, and Uzbek, right? Who are the ones who are like doing the daily activities. So each ethnic group is welcome. They often have kind of some sub-ethnic groups, but the community try to showcase a kind of supra-ethnic identity and in the front of the rest of the city. And officially also, and here also it can be discussed, you have a kind of ecumenical theology. So the mosque welcome both Shia, like Azerbaijani Shia, all the other ethnic communities will be Sunni, but they try to be welcoming all the different theological group. But as you can imagine, in the informal level, you have a lot of tension between those who are promoting a traditional Imam, a traditional Islam, are more in favor of something more close to Salafi or different kind of reading or Tablighi Jamaat and so on. And then my last point, and I will stop here after, to give the floor to Ahmed, is that what we found really fascinating is how much this Muslim community tried to root themselves in their Arctic environment and to show that Islam and Arctic identities are going very well together. And they really invest a lot of their energy in trying to create a brand of a kind of Arctic Islam. And so what we found really interesting is that there is a real will to kind of show respect for indigenous tradition. When you talk to Imam and to Muslim broadly in the far north, you can see there is this will to show respect for Karyeni, for indigenous population. And then there is this will also to kind of develop the notion of the Russian North, Ruski Sever, and trying to show that it worked well with Islam. So you can see some of the symbolic they were using. And so what we found really interesting also, and that's really a growing phenomenon, is trying to brand some products that are Islamic halal food with an Arctic brand. So there was all this attempt to produce deer meat in a halal way and hoping to sell deer meat to the Muslim community. It's not working very well in terms of business, but that's one of the strategy. And so there was interesting negotiation between some indigenous community raising deer and the Islamic community trying to buy deer and having it killed halal way. And then there is also several private firms in the Yamal region run by Tatar and Bashkir businessmen who try to create this kind of halal, Arctic halal meat and trying to target Middle Eastern and Shanghai Cooperation Organization markets. So there was if you look at the different halal fair in Russia, you now always have a kind of Arctic section that is trying to sell some halal meat, but also different kind of fruits and, you know, herbal cocoa production, pharmaceutical production done with some kind of Siberian or Arctic flowers and herbs and so on. So that was a really interesting way of trying to blend the two identity. So very briefly, in conclusion, what we see in Russia is really part of this global trend of the multinational urban identity that are growing in the Arctic. And you have exactly the same happening now in Canada and Alaska, that are really, all these Arctic cities are really becoming ultra multinational, and usually with the big Islamic communities, not only, but also. And globally in Russia, what I think it's showing is that now that you have especially a second generation of migrants, that is people that have been born in Russia and will be raised in Russia with this kind of double identity, you can see how much, especially for Khanty-Mansi and Yamal-Nenets region, the two kind of big oil extraction and gas extraction region of Russia, Islam has become really totally part of the local urban life. And I think it's Ahmed in his paper who was saying that now after the North Caucasus and the Volga region, we should consider Khanty-Mansi and Yamal-Nenets as the third, kind of becoming the third historical center for Islam in Russia. So I think on that aspect, these Arctic cities are really showing the way on how Russia is becoming more and more multinational. And I will stop here and give the floor to Ahmed. I will stop sharing.
So,
Ahmed, yeah.
So, Bob, should I start?
Yes, please.
Yes, please.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Marlene, for inviting me to participate in this excellent seminar. And I will talk about my field research in Novy Urengoy, which took place in March of 2018. And I spent more than 2 weeks in Novy Urengoy. I actually lived everyday life with local Muslims, you know, attending mosque, families, even halal hammam in Novy Urengoy, which belongs to Azeri businessman. I did 20 interviews with local Islamic authorities, ethnic activists, Islamic activists, unofficial Islamic leaders, ordinary Muslims. So I tried to, you know, talk to almost every group in local Muslim community, representatives of every group. So the ethnic composition of Muslim community in Novy Urengoy is, you know, very it comprises actually Tatars and Bashkirs, circa 10,000 people, and Chechens and Ingurs over 5,000, Nogais up to 7,000, Dagestanis up to 5,000, and Central Asians up to 10,000. So there are very few Shiites. So the Muslim community in Novy Urengoy is predominantly Sunni, and the history of the Muslim community in Novy Urengoy started in 1996 after the organization of Jamaat under the Muftiat or Muslim board of the Asian part of Russia, headed by Nafigullah Ashirov, and they leased the building for their mosque, and here they invited as imam the Uzbek Isamuddin Akbarov. He was very good, you know, in Islam, very good knowing Islam. And after that, the diverse Islamic community in Novy Urengoy united actually because, you know, they were presenting, you know, Shafi Muslims, Hanafi Muslims, also a lot of Salafis and so on. But they're all united under the authority of this Imam Isamuddin Akbarov. But local, you know, municipal authorities were not happy. First of all, with Nafigullah Ashirov as Mufti, and Dmitry Chernomorchenko, who is ethnic Russian, converted to Islam. They also, municipal authorities were not happy with him, and they tried to, you know, expel them from Novy Urengoy because, you know, Novy Urengoy is the газовая столица, it's gas capital of Russia, and they wanted to have, you know, totally loyal Islamic authority here. So in 2010, the local Imam Isamuddin Akbarov was killed, and then the Imam became his son Muhammad Akbar, but he was also, you know, expelled from Yanao, and he was forced to immigrate from Russia actually in 2015, and in 2015 also the local, you know, Muslim community was forced to, you know, attend the new mosque, which was after the under the authority of Central Muslim Board in Ufa. So that was, you know, the very tragic change of religious authority, but the local Muslims, they always said that Isamuddin was the best imam, and even now they say that he is their imam, and they are forced to go and attend the new mosque. The local community is actually very mosaic-like. There are traditional Muslims of Hanafi and Shafi madhabs, schools, Sufis, Dagestanese, Chechens, and Ingush. They actually, Dagestanese are under the spiritual board of Muslims of Dagestan. Chechens and Ingush Sufis of various weirds, or at least six different Sufi groups, and very diverse youth groups, Salafis, you know, a lot of sympathizers of, you know, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, also traditionalists, and we have very few extremists, but they are mainly under the influence of Islamic State propaganda. So all these groups have their own informal leaders whose opinion concerning religious matters predominates over the opinion of the official imam of the Novy Urengoy Mosque and of the mufti of the Yanao. And today, the mufti and the imam are compelled to maneuver and to varying extents take into account the opinion of the quite numerous and influential Salafis. Because, you know, Salafis are their own authorities. and different understandings of the Hanafi or Shafi'i tradition lead to quite serious disagreements among those who follow the same school and formally belong to the so-called traditional Islam. In other words, this re-Islamization in the Russian north, it intensifies the mosaic-like character of the Muslim community. And in the case of Novy Urengoy, where Muslims have been forced to accept a less authoritative mufti, this has strengthened the authority of the informal leaders of various groups within the community. The informal networks of Muslims are organizing themselves in all kinds of forms, making wide use of the opportunities provided by the internet, handling issues connected with keeping halal, opening halal cafes in the city, delivering of halal food, transporting the dead back to the continent, to Dagestan, to Central Asia, and so on. Creating various groups, usually on WhatsApp, that enable them to rapidly inform their co-religionists about the delivery of halal food, the timetable of prayers, and so on. Young Muslims in Novy Urengoy have also created a mobile instructional application. The name is Namaz Vdom, Namaz at Home, that works on iOS or Android, and it's enabling the user to learn how to perform daily prayers. So that's the self-organization. It's they don't deal with local muftiyat. They are doing it themselves. Also, what was interesting, we have here in Novy Urengoy how do you say, two North Caucasian power centers. The spiritual board of Muslims of Dagestan, it seems that it is supported by authorities in federal level. So this Muslim board of Dagestan has informally appointed a representative in the Yanao, and he carries on active work primarily among Dagestanis in the district, but also trying to work with all Muslims. And it strives to position itself as the center of Sufi Islam for the whole of Russia. So every year in the month of Rabi al-Awwal, the month of in which the Prophet Muhammad was born, the Dagestani Muftiyat sends a delegation to the Yanao to conduct Maulids, rites on that one of the month of the Prophet's birth. And representatives of this board try to get themselves appointed as leaders of collective prayer in the Cathedral Mosque of Novy Urengoy for these days. And another means of spreading the influence of this board is distribution of the Dagestani newspaper As-Salam, which presents itself as a national spiritual and educational periodical. It provoked the counteraction from young Muslims. So young Muslims considered representatives of the Muslim board of Dagestan to be polytheists, while the Mufti of the Yanao views them with suspicion also regarding the spiritual expansion as prelude to its institutional expansion. So the young Muslims, said no, collective prayers under the representatives of Muslim Board of Dagestan, and the local Mufti agreed. Also, the more serious power center is Ramzan Kadyrov, the head of the Chechen Republic, promotes his influence in the region more skillfully than the Dagestani Muftiyat. and he uses all possible means, including the state machine. First of all, Kadyrov began by bringing the Chechen community in Novy Urengoy under his strict control, and actually he works through his representative in Yanao, Hussein Elimbayev. He is a very important figure. And Yanao Mufti Hafizov does not conceal his apprehension at the appearance of such an influential figure in the region. And a struggle is, for instance, unfolding over control of the Halal Cafe Amina, which is located in the courtyard of the Cathedral Mosque, and it belongs to Chechens. And apparently Hafizov fears that the influence of Kadyrov and his men may gradually seep into the mosque itself. And what is very important, actually Elimbayev openly communicates with Hafizov's opponents. For example, the Mufti Nafigullah Ashirov, who was exiled from the Yanao. And in November of 2017, Ashirov awarded Kadyrov's representative the medal for the strengthening of spirituality, what is very interesting. So the I think I will make some conclusions and stop here. The community of Novy Urengoy, it has many divisions, you know, in terms of authority, in terms of, you know, tendencies and so on. But it is still, you know, unite because, you know, they are all together trying to maintain the Islamic life in circumpolar, you know, territory, trying to keep halal, trying to make their community stronger, and using all the you know meanings to do so. So I think I should stop here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, both of you, for those great presentations. So now, just to remind the audience, if you have a question, we have about 20 minutes left for questions and answers. If you have a question, please type it into the Q&A box, and then I'll ask the questions of the two speakers. So already we have two questions. One came in the chat, one in the Q&A. So let me just put both of those questions out there, then maybe start with Marlene, and then Ahmed, if you want to try and answer one or both of the questions. So the first question is, how do things stand with respect to marrying within and without the Muslim communities in these Arctic cities? And then the second question is there a significant movement to convert the indigenous population, and maybe broader, you know, what are the relationships between the Muslims coming in and the indigenous communities there? So maybe Marlene, if you want to start with those, and then we'll hopefully there'll be a few more questions in a few minutes. Let's see, Marlene, you're still on mute.
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, it should be. Yeah, there is no movement to convert the indigenous population, and they are very careful in when they have ethnic Russians trying to join the community. As you may know, there is a quite substantive ethnic Russian community, people who converted to Islam, but it's mostly in big European cities, and in small Arctic cities, the communities try to be very careful because they know that conversion will raise a lot of tensions with the Russian Orthodox Church or with nationalist groups. So they usually try to not to be very too much welcoming for ethnic Russians who would like to convert, and toward indigenous community, there is no attempt to conversion. The relationship with indigenous community here also, it's totally decentralized. First, you don't have an indigenous community in every Arctic cities, right? Depending on the cities, you may have an important one, you may have almost no indigenous. But usually the relationships are quite distant. As I said, my impression was that Islamic communities were trying to show symbolically some kind of recognition of the indigenous kind of original status. I know that in some cities there are competition for jobs because both migrant and indigenous arriving in cities all kind of compete for the same kind of job. And so in some cities, I know there have been some tensions with indigenous community complaining about labor migrant coming and taking some of the small retail job that the indigenous community were trying to get, but very often they live in kind of separate environment with different niches and don't compete. Maybe Ahmed will be able to develop. And on the marrying within or outside the community, there is no specificities for the Arctic region. I think it's the global trend that you have in Russia, that depending on the community, it's more or less open, and depending also if you are a man or a woman, it's much more difficult for a woman, a Muslim woman, to marry outside the Muslim community. It's easier for a man to marry outside the community. And here also, it's really depending on the communities. If you are Kyrgyz, it will be easier to marry outside the community. If you are Dagestani, it will be much more difficult. And by the way, in terms of interaction with indigenous people, in cities where you have an important indigenous people like Dudinka and also an important Kyrgyz community, because there is a big Kyrgyz community working on the port, on the Yenisei port in Dudinka, there have been a lot of, it seems relatively a lot of marriage, because Kyrgyz are considered not really as Muslim, but more a kind of something Siberian. And so it seems there have been kind of better interaction. So there have been several stories of Kyrgyz and indigenous marriage, but that's just one specific case. Ahmed.
Yeah, we also have very few, but Kyrgyz people who are Christians, for instance, Baptists and so on. And I think that they are more, looked like, preferable for marrying to them. And we have very few, but we have cases when Muslims try to convert indigenous Nenets people in Yanao. It's the local authorities look very, not they are not happy, and also local mufti, he says that it's better to convert ethnic Dagestanis, Kyrgyz and other people rather than Nenets people. And also Nenets people, they have their own they eat the deer meat, they are not preparing it, so it's not it's very non-Islamic. And it's very difficult to convert actually Nenets rather than Russian, because and also even Russians, very few people we have in Novy Urengoy. 3-5 families may be Russian, which converted to Islam.
Okay, so we do have another question here, and I'll address it to both of you again. The question concerns the notion of globalization. And the idea basically is that I think the speakers described the Muslims living in the polar region as highly globalized, but at least one definition of globalization is a type of modernity which is really associated with European and North American cultures and capitalism. And so how does that fit in with the cultures that you see among Muslims in the far north? Is this an example of globalization, or is it something else? So that's a very broad question. So let me first send that to Marlene and see how you want to grapple with those concepts there.
Yeah, I think it depends how you want to define globalization. I think on many aspects, these labor migrants are highly globalized in the sense that they have dense relationship with their homeland. They travel there, they are always on their phone, by social media, with everything happening in their home community. And at the same time, they try to integrate in the city where they are living, especially when they can come with their own family, because once you have the wife and the children going to school, then you have a process of kind of integrating inside the community. What I noticed is that very often migrants who are in this Arctic cities, it's not their first trip to Russia, right? Very often it's a second level of migration. They first usually went somewhere southern Siberia, like Krasnoyarsk, for example, or they went in the Moscow region. They did some kind of business, and only in a second step, they have moved to this Arctic region. So very often they also have a deep link with another region in Russia. So it's a totally multi-dimensional way of presenting themselves. And I think on that, they are globalized, right? Because they have several identities competing and several different species they relate to. But of course, it remains inside a kind of Eurasian space, right? It's not really globalized in the sense of going outside the post-Soviet region. But I think on the way also they try to integrate, to take some element of Russian culture, some element of Arctic culture, and trying to blend that with their Muslim culture. I think they are showing a quite good level of what I would describe as globalization. And in terms of capitalism and so on, what I noticed is that very often migrants, when you interview them, they are very proud of their economic success in the North, because they are really sharing this kind of Soviet myth of the North, you know, that the pioneer, the front line where you go when you are ready to work very hard, and you will succeed because you have worked hard. And they have really embraced this kind of Soviet legacy of Arctic cities as a pioneer cities, and very often for them, succeeding in a kind of a difficult, harsh climatic environment, it's seen as a personal success. So you have this kind of relationship to the success of if you are they are mostly in the private sector. So it's a kind of business entrepreneurship ideology that I think very often they have kind of blend with this Soviet myth of, or the Soviet tradition of the Arctic front, the Arctic frontier.
Yeah, Marlene, as you said, sometimes I was, you know, wondering if they are Protestants because they are thinking like Protestants. Oh, I am so successful here in terms of economics, in terms of business, you know, and that's very interesting. And also, I think that they are really globalized because they are even the Muslim young people in the north, they are part of transnational networks, and they are, you know, linked with their, you know, co-religionists in Europe, in the United States, in Middle East. And that is so interesting to, you know, see these networks working in far north, and I think that they are really globalized people.
Yeah, if I can insist on that, I think you have this kind of theology of prosperity also in Islam, right? That if you are successful economically, it's a sign that you are a good religious person, and so God is kind of rewarding you with that success. And then that's true, it's really transnational. Another example is life in the mosque. In the mosque, they meet people from all ethnic groups that they would have never met if they would have stayed in their home republic, right? So suddenly they realize that Russian language is the language of Islam when you are in an Arctic cities, because you have to speak Islam, because you will have people from North Caucasus, from Central Asia. So they have to move away from their ethnic community and suddenly speak about Islam in Russian. And as Ahmed was saying, very often they have family member in Turkey, or who have lived in, or who are, let's say, Ukraine, Poland, and so on. So on that, it's also very much globalized.
Okay, so let me get to the next questions. I'll just go in order here. So just to summarize, it sounds like there is a form of globalization taking place, but it doesn't necessarily include the Western European and North American world. It's sort of a globalization that's not 100% global, but it's part of it. It's more global than just the local cultures. But then, so the next question kind of follows a little bit along these lines. Is do you have a sense of how these Arctic adaptations to Islamic practice are viewed by the global Muslim community? How does the rest of the Muslim community view what's going on in the foreign order?
So my impression, but maybe Ahmed will know better than me, is that it's very well received, because the tradition is Islam, is that Islam should adapt to all its environment. Islam is a universalist religion. It should adapt to climate, to tradition, to wherever Islam is growing, then Islam adapts. So my interpretation is that it's really well received when Arctic Muslims have to say, like, well, depending on the, polar night, polar day, they have to adapt prior. And so Islam is a very flexible religion in terms of being sure that every Muslim all over the world can adapt to the local environment. So my impression is that it doesn't create any tensions. Where you can have tensions is that there is this general view that post-Soviet Muslims are not very good Muslim in a Middle Eastern sense because they don't really follow very closely necessarily like the 5-time prayer and other things. Their level of theological knowledge is usually quite low compared to Middle Eastern, but I don't think it's very specific in that case to the Arctic region. Ahmed.
Yeah, totally agree. The global Muslim community is involved also to discuss these problems of Arctic adaptation, and all global muftis, they are, issuing the fatwas about how to adopt Islam actually to the Arctic conditions. So that's the global Muslim, adaptation, not just, Muslims in Arctic.
Okay, so we have another question, which is focusing on Islamic education in the far north. Are there many religious schools, and are they institutionalized? And then how do the different religious schools address the differences among the different Islamic movements and approaches?
Yes, so
yeah,
so my perception was that there are very few madrasa attached to mosque because it's difficult to get them registered. And then it's usually the authorities are a little bit afraid. So only big communities can kind of lobby enough to be sure they would have some sort of a madrasa opening like 1 or 2 weeks a day for receiving children, but you have a lot of informal school, right? You have a lot of mosque or prayer houses that will receive children in a totally informal way and kind of give them the first classes on Islam and the Quran. In terms of discussing, negotiating between the different streams, my impression is that here also, depending of the community, if it's very much divided theologically, if you have strong leader, if these leaders are formal or informal, you may have community that can manage tensions between the different ideological groups, and mosques that are not very successful in that. And in that case, the community can split between those who are more kind of Sufi, those who are more kind of Salafi. You have some Tablighi Jamaat going around. So it's really, each case is different depending if you have strong leaders that can try to maintain the unity of the community, or if it got suddenly divided. But Ahmed, on that, will know better than me.
Yeah, it's almost every mosque has madrasa, and they educating, boys and girls, separately. And as Marlene said, they have in far north a lot of informal, educational institutions, not schools, but institutions. They teach at home. They have a lot of, so that's why they created this Namaz Dom application for iOS and Android. That's because of, they need to, learn, and they created these applications. And also these networks I mentioned. In these networks, they have a lot of, clips with, their sheikhs and muftis. They are explaining some things in Islam, and it's also the part of Islamic education, because their authorities, they can live, thousands of kilometers from him, and the only way to have, proper education, it's to watch these, lessons online. and they are finding information, they are finding these lessons in internet and watching it, and it's also part of Islamic education. And it's also the sign that local authorities are pushing them to this informal system of Islamic education, because the formal Islamic education is so poor.
All right, thank you. We have one more time for one more question, and this one is sort of asking what's drawing the Muslims to the far north? Is it the oil and gas industry where they traditionally work, and obviously there's considerable job opportunities, or is it the opportunity for engaging in entrepreneurship in different parts of the world? So what would you say is drawing people up there?
So I think there are at least two lines of businesses for labor migrants in these Arctic cities. So one is those who can find a job in the oil and gas or extraction industries. That's usually good paid job compared to what they can have at home. So that's really for those who can kind of professionalize their migration trajectories. It's a minority. The majority go there because you have so many ethnic Russian and Slavic population who left these Arctic cities that all the retail sector is kind of free to be conquered. So the majority of migrants go there because that's where you can run supermarket chain, have restaurants, cafe, control the bazaar, of course, selling fruit and vegetables. So in some Arctic cities, the whole private sector of cafe, restaurant, nightclub, supermarket chain, and kind of food sold on the street is entirely a migrant business because you don't have any kind of local population that would be doing that. So it's very much kind of hierarchy. You have a hierarchy of businesses, and migrants really have been able to build their niches. And for, as I said, the minority that was able to get a really kind of secure job in the extraction industry, they are higher up in the hierarchy, but the majority are controlling this kind of street and leisure businesses. And that's still good jobs. As we said, it's private entrepreneurship. You have flexibility. You can fly home sometime whenever you want. You can go back. You can move from one city to another. You can have your brother in another city and have the food delivered, and then you create your own network. And we have really success stories of Azerbaijani and Tajik families, controlling supermarket chain in different Arctic cities and progressively building their small empire, their small commercial empire, precisely because a lot of ethnic Russians are just leaving. So these cities are open in a sense for businesses. Ahmed.
You said it all.
Yes. Did you want to add anything to that, or that was a pretty comprehensive answer? Okay. So I think that we've come to the end of the hour, and I thought that was a very interesting presentation and great questions and answers. So thank you all.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the presentation, and thank you to the two speakers for a good job. So
thank you.
And I hope that you can hear it in your different homes. Thank you very much. So until next time.
Yeah, thank you all. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.